Right here we can see what is known as the compass plant. This is an extremely tall growing plant that loves growing in prairie-like environments, as we can see here, this sort of mixture of grass and prairie with a little bit of forest right behind us over here. This plant can grow up to 10 feet in height, and it's an extremely easy plant to learn how to identify. So let's take a quick look at the identification features of this plant. First off, from a distance, we're going to notice those very large yellow flowers. They're kind of growing in like a disc shape, sort of like a sunflower, and that allows this plant to stick out really well, as we can see here, along with its height, of course. If we look at the flowers of compass plant head on, we're going to notice they are very, very reminiscent of a sunflower. They will be growing in a disc or a ray-like pattern. As we can see here, this disc with this ray-like flower petals coming off, and there are going to be numerous. We're talking over 20 petals, individual petals on each one of the flowers. Now this plant is very, very stiff, so I'm not able to turn this one, and there's actually a big dip that goes down there, so I can't really get back there too easily. The flowering period of this plant is usually from the middle of July all the way until October throughout the eastern United States, or I should say eastern and central United States, excuse me. So there is a somewhat of a long flowering period of this plant. Now, whenever we take a closer look at this plant, or if you feel it in your fingers, you're going to notice it is very, very stiff and bristly. And here we can see the stem of the compass plant. We can see all these little hairs and bristles running along it. And whenever you rub it in between your fingers, it is very, very, very rough. If you were to rub your hands down it really quickly, it's actually going to scrape your skin a little bit. It's not going to draw blood, but it feels like extremely rough sandpaper. If you've ever rubbed shark skin the opposite direction, then you know what I'm talking about. It's very, very, very rough. The leaves of compass plant are very, very long, as we can see here. This leaf, for example, is probably about a foot in length. Now these leaves are very, very deeply cut, and they might be reminiscent to some people, sort of like a thistle leaf. Especially if you look at it from a distance, we can see this leaf right here. It looks somewhat like a thistle leaf, just a really, really large thistle leaf. Now remember those bristles that I was talking about? If we look at the margins of the leaves, we can see these little hairs running along the margins, and we can see these little bumps. These are the bristles that are running along the leaf of this plant. If we look at the underside of this plant, we're going to notice that the midrib is hairy, and it's also bristly on the underside of the leaf as well. If you rub this leaf in between your fingers, you're going to feel that very sandpapery, almost shark skin sort of texture. Now as we get further up the plant, we're going to notice that the leaves will grow smaller. And you might also notice that the leaves grow in an alternating pattern along the stem. So we can see a leaf coming out here, then we go up, we can see a leaf coming out here. So instead of growing opposite, these leaves will alternate going up the stem. So as we can see, compass plant is a really easy plant to identify. And there is another interesting feature about it. So let's take a look at that real quick. Compass plant gets its name from the way that its leaves will often orient themselves in a somewhat north to south direction. However, as we can see here, that's not always accurate, so I would not rely upon that for navigation. These lovely yellow coneflowers that we're looking at is known as the cutleaf coneflower or the Grey Headed Coneflower. This is an extremely important native plant. It loves growing in prairie-like environments. We can see here there's a few other prairie-like plants growing along it. There's down there next to some, there's some slenderleaf mountain mint, excuse me. We have Queen Anne's lace growing back over here. We have some red clover growing right here, and we have some ironweed that has just got done flowering. Now the cutleaf coneflower will grow in a multitude of environments as long as there's basically a little bit of a clearing. You might even find it on the edges of woods, like we can see there's a little bit of trees back here behind us. And this plant will grow almost anywhere. I found this plant, actually I've even found this in the middle of the woods where there's just a little bit of sunlight reaching the forest floor. So it can happen, though that is rare. But this is an extremely easy plant to identify as well. Now it has the very typical cone flower shape, as we can see here. This very big button-like elongated head right here, where we can see that's where the seeds will actually come on. Now, like the common name cutleaf coneflower will suggest, its leaves are very, very deeply cut, as we can see here with all these very numerous lobes running through this leaf. If we look very closely at the margins, we can see there are also serrations along the margins of these leaves. So these leaves are not only lobed, but they do have serrations along them as well. Now whenever you feel the leaves, you're going to notice that they feel a little bit rough in your hand, somewhat like the regular coneflower, purple coneflower. This plant can grow to a variety of heights, as we can see here. There are some here that are about 3.5 feet. We have some that are about 5.5 feet here, and we have one that's a little over 6 feet tall right over here. We can see some more growing right over there. Whenever you find one of these plants, you're most likely going to be finding a lot more, like we can see here. And if I look, and if I pan down this way a little bit, you can see more growing toward the end of this little connection of trails that I'm on. The stem of your gray-headed coneflower is going to be round, green, and it'll feel somewhat bristly in your hands. You're going to feel not really like sandpaper, but kind of like a very, very shallow Velcro almost in texture. And it will have, as we can notice, these little bitty ribs or indentations running the length of the stem. The leafing pattern of the cutleaf coneflower is alternating, so these leaves will alternate going up the stem, as we can see here. Interestingly enough, whenever we get down to the base of a cutleaf coneflower, we're going to notice that the leaves become much more deeply lobed and deeply cut here, like we can see, with some of these back leaflets appearing almost like lance-shaped mittens, like we can see here. And these are a little bit more bristly in texture than the ones towards the top of the plant. The leaves at the base of the plant towards the ground are going to be very long, as you can see here. This one is probably, I'm going to say probably about 7 inches in length, if not more. Now as we get up the plant and we go towards the top, we're going to notice these single leaves that are very, very short, probably only about 2.5 to 3 inches in length. And as we can see here, the margins become smooth. It's still bristly and somewhat sandpaper-like in texture. Whoops. It's still bristly and somewhat sandpaper-like in texture, but we can see that the margins are actually smooth. So this is an incredibly easy plant to identify as well. Now let's go take a look at another prairie plant that is extremely easy to identify. This unique plant that we can see right in front of us is known as Rattlesnake Master. This is another prairie plant that loves growing in sort of tall grass prairies, like we can see here. I'll pan around so you guys can see. Now the flowers of Rattlesnake Master are very, very unique, and I've not seen a single flower, at least in my area of Indiana, that looks anything like these. These flowers are very, very stiff, very, very dense, and if I am able to get them here, we can see some of its native pollinators doing their thing. Now if you see the plant in this stage, it's going to appear as if its flowering period is almost done or just beginning, because it looks like these flowers are closed. That's only because this plant only opens up its flowers big enough for very small flies and mosquitoes and wasps and bee species, its pollinators, to get inside the flowers to get to the pollen. And here we can see the tips of the flowers with some of its pistils and stamens coming out here. We can also see some flower bracts underneath by my thumb. Rattlesnake Master will grow to a varying number of heights. Like we can see, this one here is about 4.5 to almost 5 feet in height. And then this one here is right around 4 feet in height. So there is going to be a bit of variation in your Rattlesnake Master heights. Now the really interesting part of this plant, in my opinion, are its leaves. We can see here these very long grass-like leaves. They almost look sort of reminiscent of a yucca or agave species, actually, though it's not related to any one of those. We can see these what look like spines, and you would think that they would be basically like thorns or like the pricks on a cactus, but they're not. These are actually very, very easy to touch, and they're very, very flexible as well. The leaves are interesting also in that they have this sort of whitish green sort of appearance that somewhat rubs off. And if we flip it under to the underside of the leaf, we'll notice it's basically the exact same color. There are a lot of veins that run vertically or the lengthwise of the leaf. And it will have an alternating leafing pattern, as we can see here. We can see these leaves will alternate growing up the plant. And we'll also notice that they will be clasping, these leaves will clasp around the stem with this little sheath, this little papery-like sheath that goes around the stem of the plant. Now the stem of Rattlesnake Master is smooth and it is stiff, but you will also notice these veins, very dense veins running the lengthwise of the stem. If you roll it between your fingers, it's very stiff and woody-like in texture. It doesn't bend very easily, as we can see here. The whole plant's actually rather flexible, which is really interesting. It's kind of fun to play with, honestly. But this plant has long been used for medicine as sort of a poultice for rattlesnake bites. That's one of the reasons it gets its name, Rattlesnake Master. So this is an incredibly important plant, not only for native pollinators, but it was also incredibly important for plains and prairie tribes here in North America. Now right here we can see what is known as Dogbane. This is a poisonous plant that some people will often confuse with milkweed. This plant was an extremely important resource for cordage and rope all across the Americas. Dogbane will have small white flowers like we can see here, and they're sort of like little cups. If I turn this one to the side, they're like little bitty cups almost, with 4 little points, sort of like a crown. The flower clusters of Dogbane are not going to be as numerous as you will see, or as dense as you will see on common milkweed. The leaves are also much, much smaller, as we can see here. This leaf is only maybe about 2 to 2.5 inches in length, versus your common milkweed leaves will be several inches in length and a few inches in width. Common milkweed will be about the width of this leaf in length. And we're going to take a look at some common milkweed here in just a minute after we're done talking about Dogbane. Now, one interesting feature that you're going to notice with Dogbane is that it has this red stem. This is an easy way to separate it from your common milkweed, especially in this time of the year. Like the other plants that we've looked at today, common Dogbane loves growing in a prairie-like environment. We can see some bee balm, we can see some of the cut leaf coneflower back there. We can actually see right there about the center of the frame, whoops, the daisies. Right there about the center of the frame, we can see some regular coneflower or echinacea growing there as well. This plant can grow to a variety of different heights. The ones that we're looking at right here are growing probably about 3.5 to almost 4 feet in height. And usually I don't find them growing much taller than that, but sometimes you will find them a bit shorter. The flowering period of common Dogbane is usually throughout the middle of summer, but I notice its flowers start coming on at around the beginning of July and will usually last about a month, give or take. Now that may be different in your area, so keep that in mind. Now another interesting feature about this plant is after it's flowered, it starts to produce its fruits and seed pods. As we can see here, there's very long, almost mung bean-like pods that grow off of it, versus common milkweed will have much, much different pods to it. The leaves of common Dogbane are somewhat ovate and egg-shaped, and they are a very dark green with a bright green midrib running through them like we can see here in the center of this leaf. The margins of the leaves are going to be smooth. And if we flip it over to the underside of the leaf is going to be much lighter green in appearance and color than the top of the leaf. Another really cool thing about this plant is that just like with common milkweed, we can see here it produces this milky white sap whenever a leaf is plucked off of it or the plant is damaged. And this is another reason that some people will consider this or call this or confuse this with common milkweed, but they are very, very different plants. Now this plant is not only poisonous to humans, it's also poisonous to livestock as well. So if you have, a livestock field or a pasture for your livestock and you see this plant growing in it, it's one that you might want to think about removing so your animals don't consume it, because it can actually poison them. So make sure you keep that in mind as well, because I know there are a lot of people on my channel who have livestock. Now Dogbane is very, very interesting in the way that its leaves will arrange themselves along the main stem of the plant. We can see these leaves right here are growing opposite of each other, but if we go up just a little bit more, I can turn this to the side, we're going to see again opposite, and then here we're going to see that the leaves alternate towards a node. Right before a node they will alternate, and then they start growing opposite again like we can see here. And so that's a really interesting feature of this plant, because if we look at this other common Dogbane, we can see that it's doing the exact same thing from the main stem of the plant. Right before it starts branching off at this node, at the upper node, about halfway up the plant, you'll see the leaves will alternate, but only just once. If we look at another branching node towards the top of the plant, we're going to notice that the leaves are growing in an opposite fashion, instead of that alternating pattern that we see once along the plant. So that's a really interesting feature to common Dogbane, and it is an extremely easy plant to identify. Now let's take a look at common milkweed for a comparison. One thing we're going to notice right off the bat is these very large globules of flowers that are going to be pink to red. And your field guides are going to say pink to red, but in my experience, they're more of this purplish pink that we are seeing right here. Milkweed is an extremely distinct plant. It's also a very beautiful plant. This plant can be commonly found growing along the edges of fields like cornfields, hayfields, grassy areas, plains and prairies, and things like that. If we take a step back, we're going to notice these bright pink and red globes or globe shapes of flower clusters that are going to indicate common milkweed. And as we can see here, we're looking in the edge of a field. This is actually the edge of a very small clearing that I have in my yard. Right behind it, we have a swamp with some black willows and some other plants growing along the edge. There's even some wild grapes, things like that. So this isn't always indicative of the type of environment, but generally speaking, you want to look in places where there are fields, where there are clearings, where there's prairie type environments, and you're going to be finding a lot of milkweed. You don't want to go real deep into the forest because your odds of finding it are going to decrease dramatically. If we look at the growth form of common milkweed, we're going to notice a couple of things. One of the things we're going to notice about the growth form of common milkweed is how its leaves will grow on opposite sides of the stem, just like we can see right here with these two leaves. And the further that we go down the plant, we're going to keep noticing this opposite leaf pattern all the way down the stem of common milkweed. The leaves of common milkweed are very long. They're very elliptical in shape, almost an oval sort of shape, but they're so long that they're going to be considered elliptical. The margins or edges of the leaves are going to be smooth. There are no teeth or lobes on these leaves in any way, shape, or form. Now, these leaves have another very unique feature if we look very closely. If we look at the underside of the leaves on common milkweed, we're going to notice this very bright white prominent vein, versus if we look at the top, we're going to notice the vein isn't near as distinct, but it is tinged with this reddish pinkish hue running all the way through the length of the middle of the leaf. These leaves are very thick. Whenever you feel them in the hand, they have this sort of downy bloom all the way across the surface of the leaf, and this helps them to feel kind of like suede, like if you had a piece of suede in between your fingers and you rub it, or a really thick, heavy piece of toilet paper. And these leaves actually do make pretty good toilet paper because they're so large and they're very broad. They cover the hand very well. However, there are some other unique features to this plant, so let's look at this plant stem to see some of these other features. Now, if we look very closely at the stem of common milkweed, we're going to notice that it's just round. There are no reddish tinges along the stem, but also we might notice this bloomy, like fuzzy substance across the stem. And this is on the leaves as well as the stem of common milkweed. If we look at the flowers of common milkweed from the front, we're going to notice 5 petals in a circular fashion that almost look like they're completely separated, but they're not. They're just all connected on these huge globules that make these circular pods that contain all of the various flowers. And there can be hundreds of flowers on a milkweed plant because all these flowers can come out of the nodes of the leaf stem. And then once we get towards the top of the milkweed plant, we're going to notice even more of these little globules of flowers, and they might become a little bit smaller the further we go up the plant, but the leaves definitely become smaller the further towards the top you get on common milkweed. And this look right here at the very top of this milkweed plant shows just how small these leaves can actually get once we get towards the top. They will retain that very long elliptical shape with the smooth margins, and they'll feel very bloomy or sort of kind of like suede in the hands even at the top. All of the plant will feel this way except for the flower clusters. They will feel basically just like a cluster of flowers within your hands. Now, if we look back off over here, we're going to see some more milkweed plants. These plants are actually about 1.5 feet taller than the one that we're looking at right now. Those guys are probably about 5 feet tall right now, and I'm a good distance away, and I'm leaning back, so it doesn't really look the same on camera, but they are about 5 feet tall. The one that we were just looking at is about 4 feet tall. So common milkweed can grow anywhere from 4 foot tall all the way up to about 5.5 feet tall. I've seen some a few inches taller, and I've seen some a few inches shorter. It just really depends on where they're growing, that particular plant, and things like that.